Hey Star Wars fans, and welcome back to another deck profile for Star Wars Unlimited here on Main Deck. This week we're going to be going over a control deck that I have been absolutely loving. This is Mono Vigilance, yes, Mono Blue Director Krennic. No command in sight because I don't think we need it. We have such massive control over the board with the huge pool of blue Vigilance removal options. We have tons of the most powerful Sentinels in the game, and we have lots and lots and lots of healing access main board. So those aggro decks, we can squish them even if they go through saboteur tricks to try and get through our Sentinels. We're just loaded with options to be able to deal with things. And yeah, we have some tools to go kind of late against mid-range and control decks, put down hopefully superior threats or gain some advantage through Super Laser Blast and take over the game. So without any further ado, let's take a look at this list and explain everything. What's up everyone, it's Dan with Main Deck, and yeah, I'm feeling a little blue today, so let's jump right in and look at our Director Krennic Mono Blue deck profile for Star Wars Unlimited. Here's the list, you'll see it right here. This is such a fun deck to play, and it has a few card choices that took me honestly like a little bit to tweak to get to the point where I'm pretty satisfied with where the deck is. Let's start right at the beginning with our leader, Director Krennic. If you have not gotten to play with or against Director Krennic so far, or if you're like me and you totally underrated him right away, Director Krennic is actually an excellent leader. On his leader side, he just has one static ability, which is that your friendly units that are damaged are going to get +1/+0. And while that damage bonus doesn't seem like it's a lot, it really pushes our power thresholds to the point where a lot of our units will be able to deal with something, or at least deal a little bit of damage to something, and then have the power to take out another threat. So you can gain incremental advantage throughout the game by getting your units to be slightly more powerful than theirs when you're setting up these plays, especially with your big Sentinels. And it lets you do some pretty cheeky things where you can get something damaged and then use an ability to throw a shield on it and end up cracking through multiple things with that bigger stat bonus before they can finally get through and deal with your threat, which is really, really nice. The cool thing about Director Krennic is even if he comes back to his leader side, if you deploy him and then he gets defeated, unlike most leaders in the game, he still is going to do something that turn. So it's a little cheeky way that Krennic's able to get a little bit of extra value, because most leaders come back exhausted and then have an exhaust ability. Krennic can come back exhausted, but it doesn't matter. His effect is still in play. So let's talk about that deploy side as well. Director Krennic deploys on 5. That is huge, honestly. Deploying on 5 is huge because you get to put him out at a key stage of the game to get out there and start to gain you some HP with his Restore 2 ability. He is a 2/7. Now that 2 obviously is not a lot, but that 7 is a huge amount of HP, and we'll show a couple ways that we really take advantage of that as well. And he still has each friendly damage unit gets +1/+0, and that includes himself. So often, unless the opponent has a way to ace him at 7 right away, often Krennic is going to be able to deal at least 2 to something and 3 to something else before he ends up getting taken out. Hopefully one of those is an attack. You're going to get a little bit of restore off of that also, but there are ways to get lots and lots of attacks with him or up that damage even more. So let's take a look at his support in here. Now, number one, the base we're using is Security Complex, and I know a lot of control players are going to think, well, that's absolutely wrong. You need to run the 30 HP base, and I'm going to tell you guys right now, if you really feel comfortable with a 30 HP base, you certainly can. Go ahead and run it in there. I find that Security Complex is a super useful card because there are some key units that putting a shield on will save you far more than 5 HP by allowing you to deal with more things than you were going to be able to deal with, or by making your game just end faster, because when you put that on certain units, you're going to get so many attacks off that the opponent's going to die before they can even take you out. So I like Security Complex quite a bit, but if you're comfortable with a 30 HP base, feel free to play that as well. I do think that shield token is really nice for the strategy in this deck though. Starting with the ground units, we have 3 copies of Scout Bike Pursuer. Scout Bike Pursuer is one of our only 2 sets of 2-drops in this deck. We only run 6 2-drops. We'll talk about Inferno IV in a little bit. Scout Bike Pursuer is in here because Scout Bike Pursuer is a good turn 1 play against aggro decks to be able to deal some damage to stuff, sometimes taking things out, things like Greedos or there are a couple other 2/1s in the game that 2 and 3 ones in the game, the Scoutbike Pursuer can take out and then get some damage on him, and then he's able to actually take out another unit. And actually, occasionally in games against maybe longer game decks, the Scoutbike Pursuer can get a little damage on early, and then actually do a lot of damage to the opponent. If you can keep their board clear, if you get into a good kind of rhythm of clearing their board, Scoutbike Pursuer is going to usually be able to crack in for like 3 or 4 damage every single turn, which puts a significant clock on the opponent, especially if they're running a 25 HP base. So he's a pretty decent 2-drop. I've never really hated having him, although a lot of times in this deck, your turn 1 is actually just going to be taking the initiative. It's not that important to have a 2-drop in your opening hand, which is why we only have 6 total. Cloud City Wingguard is in here at 3, and I usually prefer Cell Block Guard in here, but in here we wanted as many blue cards as possible with the one exception of I Am Your Father, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Trust me, guys, on that one. That is an interesting pick, but I really like it. Cloud City Wingguard is in here because as a 2/4, he's normally... He survives the 3 damage units, but he doesn't usually deal things back because he only has 2 power, so a lot of like 3 3s or 2 3s can attack into him, and they won't get taken out, but then that Krennic buff will come into play and he'll become a 3/4, which means sometimes this Cloud City Wingguard can like attack a Spec 4 soldier, take it out, and then become a 3/4 with Sentinel, and the opponent's going to have to ram like a Sabine or something into that'll then take out 2 things. So really, again, that damage threshold just helping us kind of get sometimes 2 for 1s or like 1.5 for 1s, but that's okay. As long as we're incrementing a little bit on our value, that is how we ultimately win the game. And speaking of incrementing on our value, Death Trooper does exactly that just on the card. As a, obviously with Director Krennic, he works perfectly, but as a 3/3 with his 1 blade, deal 2 damage to a friendly unit and 2 damage to an enemy ground unit. So at the very base level, you have nothing else in play. Let's say you did a take initiative, turn 1, and then turn 2 you play Death Trooper. He can deal 2 damage to himself, 2 damage to an enemy unit, sometimes taking a unit out, not always, but always setting himself up to be a 4/3 or setting up another unit to have that damage buff from Director Krennic, which you can be pretty, I mean, you can get some pretty keen kills with that, getting him to 4. 2 damage onto something else, and maybe something you attacked with Scoutbike Pursuer. If you go Scoutbike Pursuer turn 1, attack something for 1, turn 2, Death Trooper, finish it off. Now you have a 4/3 and your Scoutbike Pursuer, or you put the 2 damage on your Scoutbike Pursuer to have a 4/3 over there. Then your Scoutbike Pursuer can attack as a 4/3 into something else, and your Death Trooper is ready as a 3/3. These two work so nicely together. They're like peanut butter and jelly. They're a great opening to have. Death Trooper just often very, very good against those aggressive decks. Now, Lieutenant Chilson, I'm going to say right here, I think he's the best card in this deck. I think he is absolutely incredible. I mean, okay, look, I meant this is a deck with stuff like Avenger in it, so like, I know that's maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but Lieutenant Chilson is a card you aggressively mulligan for against aggressive decks because this deck is built to try and get him with 4 counters all the time, and you really, especially if it's a deck running blue, you cannot undervalue him having 4 counters on him, becoming a 6/6. It takes him out of takedown range, and it makes it just so much harder to deal with him. The 5 damage threshold is a lot easier to hit than the 6 damage threshold, and when you get him to be a 6/6, most of the time, Chilson is going to take 2 things out on his own, which is, again, there we go, 2 for 1 territory. That is exactly what we're looking for. So if you skip, the key math to understand here is if you skip your first turn play, then Lieutenant Chilson can always come down as a 6/6, provided if you have an I Am Your Father that you're not going to play, you resource it at least on the turn that you were going to play Chilson. If you do have a turn 1 play, you are still able to get him down as a 6/6 with I Am Your Father in the right circumstances, which is part of the reason that is there. Those two are working together perfectly, going a turn 1 like Scoutbike Pursuer, turn 2 I Am Your Father, turn 3 Lieutenant Chilson. If they chose to let you draw the cards, then you are going to get him down as a 6/6. If they chose to let something die, then you know what, you're not too mad about that either, and then your Chilson's going to come out as a 5/5, but they have less in play. So it works out perfectly. That is kind of the combo there. I Am Your Father and Chilson, I think, work really well in sequence in this deck. And Chilson is just going to be an absolute house. In those aggro games, the more Chilsons you draw, the better odds you have of winning that, unless they're really, really pushing the Saboteur angle, but we have answers for that too. So Gideon Hask is in here. 3 copies of this guy. 5-drop, 5/5 with when an enemy is defeated, give an experience token to a friendly unit. This is a card you only really want to play Gideon when you are in kind of, you have established control of the game, the opponent is kind of floundering, you have the initiative, they don't have anything on board that you need to immediately answer. And what's going to happen is Gideon is going to come down and start to put that clock on your opponent. Now, anything they play, you're going to try and answer it, then Gideon's going to make something bigger. Keep in mind, Gideon does get to put an experience token on something if they just like ambush into him and he kills something. The thing dies on the ambush, then as long as they die at the same time, you're going to get that experience counter. Really nice for actually setting up experience counters on Director Krennic, for example, or buffing up your other Sentinels, or powering up your Scout Bike. I have a few games with Scout Bike Pursuer, getting a few experience counters on him, and just becoming like a 9 damage swinging Scout Bike Trooper. It can get kind of insane. So it works really nicely in here, but Gideon Hask, you really want to be in the right position to play. You don't slam him out there on that sort of that turn 4. If your opponent has a big board, he's not going to do a lot. Your opponent's going to ignore him. You need to be playing other things to deal with the board at that point. And I like him a lot in especially mid-range matchups where the opponent is not pushing quite as aggressively, and what he's going to do is like let you outvalue your opponent with your units. So I really like him a lot, though. Been a big fan of him. Now Bendu is in here. Bendu is not getting a lot of play, but I actually think he's pretty sweet in here. I was for a while playing the Academy Walker, but the Academy Walker just never really did its thing. There were never enough damage units to play to put experience counters on. Whereas Bendu is a 4/7 Sentinel, which is 2 more HP than the 5/5 Walker, which dies to Takedown, by the way. But Bendu does not die to Takedown. Bendu is going to take a little bit of a beating, and that benefit again with Krennic is that he'll deal 4 damage on the first time he's attacked or the first time he attacks, and then he'll deal 5 damage on the second time, which is going to be quite a bit. And if you can get an attack off with Bendu, the next non-heroism, non-villainy card you play costs 2 less. That actually can let you play some pretty powerful turns on the turn. You have like 7 resources. Playing Vigilance for only 2 is insane. Playing Vanquish for only 3 is super good. Takedown for only 2 is good. Power of the Dark Side is a card that usually sometimes it feels like it takes up your whole turn to use, but being able to play Power of the Dark Side and a Takedown and a Vigilance and a Vanquish, something you can start doing to allow yourself to like clear the board with one of those other cards so your Power of the Dark Side can hit their leader or something. So Bendu enables some pretty powerful turns like that, which I really like. And also the next card, Cargo Juggernaut, becomes 2 costs less without Bendu, with a Bendu trigger, I should say. But keep in mind, here's a really spicy little play with Bendu before I move on to the Juggernaut. But Bendu can attack into something in order to take it out, even if he dies also, and he will make the next Bendu you play cost 2 less as well. So then you can replace him for only 4 if you happen to have the 2 Bendu hand, which is actually pretty cool. So I've been a fan of Bendu. I like the Bendu in here. Cargo Juggernaut, we have a 3. This has been a remarkably obnoxious card for people. That shielded late in the game when you just need to get something to stick to finish the game off is pretty cool. And of course, against aggro or the sort of mid-range decks that are pushing damage, that heal 4 is just a huge swing that the opponent has sometimes a lot of trouble getting over, a lot like the heal 5 on Vigilance. The combination of 3 of those and 3 Vigilance with Director Krennic's Restore 2 gives you a pretty healthy amount of life to deal with, where that 25 health base really feels like not a huge deal to me. So I like the Juggernauts in here too. And of course, keep in mind, we're playing a lot of late game stuff in here with the 3 Juggernauts, 2 Bendu, and some of the following cards here, because we're trying to go late and then we want to have better plays than our opponent. So in the next one, we have Count Dooku at a 7 cost, 5/4 shielded. Again, a lot of shielded things, just really obnoxious for the opponent to be able to deal with, or lets you trade into things and still keep a threat on board. Count Dooku will have that shielded, so you can potentially get a 2-for-1 off of him, but also has that when played, you can defeat a unit with 4 or less remaining HP, giving you a nice threshold to try and hit on some of these stronger things. You can deal 3 damage to the enemy's Boba Fett leader, and then finish off with Count Dooku. Now, that Boba Fett's been around a little too long if you're finishing him off with Count Dooku, but there'll be plenty of good targets. The opponent ambushes a Vader in, takes something out. Well, Count Dooku can finish him off now, and then have shielded, be tough to deal with. So he's been really nice. I like him at 2. It's about right, I think. Now, looking at our space units, we have 3 Inferno IV. Inferno IV is the unit that does so much and so little at the same time. It's such a weird card, but the when played, when defeated is super useful. Just being able to set up, find the exact cards you need, try and dig to Chilson's, find your Power of the Dark Side, your Takedown, your Vigilance, your Vanquish, your Removal when you need it, or pushing space units to the bottom when you don't need to see them. That's, it does a lot of little work and just kind of setting up your next draws a little bit. But otherwise, it's 2/3. It's here just because in a couple of turns, it can take out an A-Wing. That's it. The unfortunate thing is it takes a couple of turns. It's like attack into it. And then the nice thing is that now when it attacks into an A-Wing gets that 1 damage. Now from Krennic's buff, it becomes a 3/3. You could potentially swing it into a red 3 that gets played and still take that out. With that damaged A-Wing, you can deal with it later with something, or it just puts 2 damage on something like a Falcon so that a Vigilance can finish it off if it needs to. It just does a little bit of damage in space. Honestly, it's a card I would be looking to potentially replace in the future. It's something that maybe does a little bit more, but right now in set 1, it does the job. It does what we needed to do. System Patrolcraft is in here because, again, the 3/4 Sentinel in space is actually surprisingly strong. And with Krennic, it becomes a 4/4. It can actually, System Patrolcraft can take out a red 3 and then become strong enough to take out a Falcon on its own too, which is awesome. This is where you keep seeing all these situations where Krennic's little damage buff actually really comes into play and is really great. So awesome card to have. Avenger is in here as our big finisher. You want to close the game with Avenger, of course, and it is certainly powerful, especially when you've been able to use all your removal to keep control of the board. Then dropping this 8/8, clearing whatever they have, and then every single turn you get 1 free clear when it attacks. Importantly, against certain decks that are control mid-range that are going to play cards like Relentless, Avenger is one of the key ways that you're able to actually deal with that Relentless. If you can get them to a position where they drop a Relentless on an empty board, your Avenger automatically counters it. Otherwise, it can attack into it at the very least and maybe get rid of some of their pressure when it gets played and deal with it that way. But you need to have some big units because otherwise those giant spaceships are going to deal with you. So Avenger is great for Relentless in particular, where we have removal to deal with some of the other cards a little more easily. Now, looking at our removal suite, I already talked a lot about I Am Your Father. I want to be really clear about this card. Now, I Am Your Father is not the card that you use to deal with your opponent's leader when you absolutely have to get rid of it or deal with some gigantic threat they just played, because every single time it's really important that it deals with a threat they're going to choose to let you draw the cards. I Am Your Father is here as an early game play. You want to play this on turn 2. Ideally, you pick whatever threat they have, as long as it's like a semi-relevant threat. You know, it's not great on Mon Mothma or something, but if it's like a Battlefield Marine, sure. I Am Your Father it. They will either choose to let the threat go, which is like, great, that's exactly what I wanted to do because now I'm closer to my power of the dark side's mattering and I've prevented some damage from being dealt to myself. Or they'll let you draw 3 cards, to which you go, okay, that's fine because I'm going to draw a bunch of better removal than I Am Your Father. Or I'm going to draw my Sentinel threats, I'm going to find my Chilson, or I'm going to get enough cards to be able to get Chilson to 4 experience counters if I already played a Scout Bike Pursuer or an Inferno IV on turn 1. So I Am Your Father does a lot of good work early in the game, but otherwise you want to just late in the game, you might consider just resourcing it because you're probably going to have many better cards to play that are actually going to deal with threats. And that's perfectly fine, and getting it out of your hand so you aren't counting on it for an experience counter from Chilson because it's the only non-blue card in the deck. That's also pretty good too. Power of the Dark Side, I don't know what you can say about this that hasn't been said. It makes the opponent sack something so that it can actually deal with leaders as long as you're keeping the board relatively clear. It is the strongest removal card you have. As long as they have only 1 thing in play, it deals with it for only 3. But it is a little tricky sometimes. The opponent floods the board. Make sure you're attacking their units with your units, which is usually pretty doable. Clear off the chaff and then let the Power of the Dark Side hit whatever they can. Proper play, proper sequencing of Power of the Dark Side is going to make the difference in winning these games, certainly. Takedown, again, what hasn't been said about Takedown already, it deals with leaders. You just have to put a little damage on them, which fortunately this deck is quite good at doing. Death Trooper and Takedown are an excellent combo to deal with problematic cards as well, letting you deal with Boba Fett by just putting 2 damage on with the Trooper and then using the Takedown. Super, super nice to have. Later in the game, sometimes Takedown is a card you can resource because you are going to have things like Vanquish and Super Laser Blast. That will be plenty. You'll have Count Dooku's, you'll have Vigilance, you will have just gigantic units from Gideon or Chilson will come down as a 6/6 again. You know, you have lots of options, but it's a card you don't feel terrible about resourcing it late, but definitely hold on to it, you know, if you're going to need the removal. Vigilance, honestly, one of the best things about playing Mono Blue is Vigilance at 4. This card does so much work. It's just absolutely crazy. The mill discard 6 option, not something that you're going to use too often, even against other control decks. You'd rather just be kind of taking over the game and attacking rather than really trying to play for a mill win. But heal 5 from your base, huge against the highly saboteur-focused aggressive decks, letting you stay in the game. Putting a shield on something is sometimes useful. Often against the aggressive decks, the heal is going to be better, but the shield can be pretty nice, especially if your opponent is not running blue, where you know they're going to have to run things into stuff. And notice that it can also hit your leader. Don't forget, you can put a shield on Krennic, which can actually be pretty huge as well. And of course, my favorite mode is deal with a unit that has 3 or less remaining HP, which is a pretty, again, a surprisingly easy threshold to get set up. I really like using Vigilance early in the game, especially against things like Consortium Star Viper that are just like going to be annoying threats to deal with in Space Arena because we don't have a ton of space. It is a perfect card for dealing with that and getting some extra benefit as well early in the game or late in the game. The more Vigilance you can play for 4 while still doing other relevant things, the more like kind of free turns you're buying yourself to gain control of the board, and it is also helping you control the board at the same time. So obviously the card's just nuts. Card is really, really good. I think one of the strongest of the aspect legendaries and really shines in this deck. Vanquish, it defeats non-leader things, and these control matchups sometimes going to come down to who has more Vanquishes and Super Laser Blasts, and then endgame threats to try and drop on the opponent and get a clear board to control. Vanquish and Super Laser Blast card you need to hold in those mid-range and aggro and control games. Against aggro decks, not as useful. Takedown is usually just as good as Vanquish, and Vanquish costs 1 more, but sometimes it's clutch still. Super Laser Blast is in here, and I think Super Laser Blast gets a little misunderstood by people sometimes. This is not an anti-aggro card necessarily, because aggro is usually going to kill you before you can Super Laser Blast. That's just how that works. You can gain a lot of life, but if you get to the point where your Super Laser Blast actually hits a lot of things on board, they've been able to deal way more damage than the life that you can gain from it. Super Laser Blast is surprisingly in here mostly for the late mid-range and control mirror matches. What you want to happen is, let's say your opponent's playing Palpatine, which is sometimes kind of a nightmare to deal with because he can just take your Avengers, he can just take your Chilson if he wants to, whatever. You can take some things that are pretty annoying. And Super Laser Blast deals with Palp, deals with the thing he took, so you don't have to like lose a card as well to deal with your own threat, and deals with whatever else is sitting on the board. The opponent is trying to push ahead of you by playing multiple massive threats. Super Laser Blast is an excellent tool to have in your arsenal there. It is often not a super useful card against the very aggressive decks, simply because you just can't really get to that stage in the game without having already controlled the board. But when the game is going later, it is a nice tool to have in your arsenal, because it's one of the few ways that blue can actually like cleanly 2-for-1 against a big board of massive threats like that. Otherwise, it's usually a lot of just 1-for-1. Vanquish that. Vanquish your big thing. Deal some damage to something and then Vigilance it, that kind of stuff. So really like having the blast in here, and I do recommend putting the third one in the side as well to bring in if you need to take out some of your anti-aggro stuff for more blasts. Finally, Protector. Now, talk about an underrated card. Protector has been a house for me. It is actually really sweet. That +1/+1, again, we're talking damage thresholds. You have to keep in mind the marginal gain of +1/+1. It is bigger than it looks. And for just 1, it is such a sweet spot in this deck, because you can set up these turns where it's turn 4, you're going to take down something and you have 1 resource left over. Why not put a Protector on Director Krennic? That is my favorite play with Protector, by the way. Putting Protector on Director Krennic makes him a 3/8 naturally, that then becomes a 4/8 after he has dealt damage. With Sentinel, the opponent has to attack into him. Now, I know it can be sometimes a shame to lose your leader by giving him Sentinel, but at the same time, Krennic with Protector is usually going to hold down the fort so well. You're going to buy yourself multiple turns to get into that late stage of the game where you're going to start dropping Dookus. You're going to have access to all your removal. You're going to get yourself to Avenger. It's going to work out just fine. And at the least, your Protector can just be a really cheap +1/+1 to get over a threshold or make an emergency Sentinel when you need. If you don't have anything else to deal with space, your opponent's coming in, putting a Protector on an Inferno IV to make a 3/4 Sentinel is the same as getting that system Patrol Craft when you need it, and that can buy you the time. It can deal with space threats. Nobody's running a ton of space threats right now, so if you just deal with 1 or 2 ships by putting a Protector on an Inferno IV, that's also just enough to get there. So it's a really nice card. And again, I usually put the final copy in the side to bring in against the highly aggressive decks, because again, just dropping like Scout Bike Pursuer with Protector is actually really good too. You can play some early game plays that actually can do quite a bit of work with it that you wouldn't have access to otherwise, especially with how cheap it is in Mono Blue. So that is the list. That is everything we're playing, and I think I've talked about just about every deck you might play against with this, and I have had success against a lot of these decks. I've had some really close control games before I started to tweak the deck a little bit more for control, and I think it's got a better game against it now. And I've played a lot of aggressive decks, and none of them have quite been able to take over, especially if you see a lot of Chilsons in your life. Don't forget to mull aggressively for Chilson. A great start to see is I'm Your Father, Chilson, and anything else in your hand. That is a really awesome start. You're gonna have good games when you see starts like that. Let's just talk a little bit about some sideboard options you might want to play in here as well. And as usual, my little caveat to the sideboard here is I'm not giving you an exact sideboard because I think you need to look at what your local meta is playing, or what you expect to play at a major tournament you might take this to, and then tweak for that. But here are some of the sideboard options that I think are really good to have in the deck. Number one, Baze Malbus might have been a card that some people were thinking, well, where the heck is Baze? He makes perfect sense in here. He has grit, he gets Sentinel. And I like Baze. I like Baze against aggro, and I don't really like Baze against mid-range and control because a lot of the time you are not going to necessarily be able to hold initiative. You're not going to have good control over that. Those aggro and those mid-range and control decks might be playing blue where they just take him down and it's not very useful. And then his stats aren't great for his cost, and your opponent gets to kind of play around the grit. I just don't love him that much in enough matchups to want to have a main board, but I usually run 3 copies side because I do like just having, he's in against aggro just to have more Sentinel cards. You want more cards that say Sentinel on them, especially if the opponent's aggro deck is really not respecting Saboteurs enough, and you're just going to be able to totally control them by having enough 4-drop Sentinels that you can just always have one in play as you are building out. Again, versus aggro, make an opening. A great option to have in here. A couple copies, two or 3 is great depending on how much you think you're going to play against aggro, but you're already pretty decent against aggro. This is really just kind of shore up your matchup. You pull out things like Super Laser Blasts. You can pull out like a copy or 2 of Avenger. You don't really need to have all of those in that aggro match. Usually, again, you're not always going to make it there, so it's not really that important. And you can put in some of these cards that just deal with problematic cards, do some healing, that kind of stuff. Now, against mid-range and control matchups, what you are concerned about is having more threats and more removal. So I like putting in AT-AT Suppressor against those mid-range and control decks because it's just an 8/8 for 8. It's a big 8/8 for 8 that can also sometimes kind of slow down any damage dealing they can deal and kind of give yourself the advantage. Okay, like it's balls in my court now. I'm going to start to deal with things. Dropping AT-AT Suppressor, if you're able to take the initiative right afterwards, then the next turn you can slam it into whatever major ground threat your opponent has and take it out, and hopefully that is going to be useful for you. This is also a pretty cool card if you keep Protector in your deck in that matchup. Throw a Protector on AT-AT Suppressor and watch the opponent squirm as they have to deal with a 9/9 Sentinel now. It's not the worst thing in the world either. Super Laser Blast number 3, I often will just shore up the numbers on that card against mid-range and control as well, just because you do want to have it so that when you can play into it, you can not commit too much to the board, get the opponent to commit more, and then blast the board. Then you can drop your Avenger and gain control of the game. And then Entrenched is always a nice card to have. It's just occasionally is useful against random stuff. Like, again, this Cheer It deck, if your opponent's playing the Cheer It deck, entrenching their Cheer It makes them pretty sad. You can try to just play to space with your Avengers then at that point. Or if the opponent is playing a deck that like plays mostly ground, but then it runs home 1 or something, Entrench is a nice card to bring in against like a specific threat like that, where you can just slap it on the home 1 and go, okay, I don't really care about this anymore. I'm not going to have to deal with it until way later. Maybe I'll get a Super Laser Blast for it later or something, but it can just buy you some time to find the blast you need, or you can entrench the opponent's leader if you don't want them to be attacking with their big old leader or something until you can buy time to find like a Super Laser Blast or something like that. So all decent options. Another thing you do is shore up any of those 2-drops in there. Like I said, I usually put in the 3rd copy of Protector. I think that's a great option too. Anything you feel like has been useful for you, feel free to shore it up, but that's kind of some options that I like to look at for the sideboard. So that is the deck list. I hope you guys give this one a shot. Let me know in the comments down below if you do play this and how you feel about it. Like I said, I really love this, but I'm a dirty control player. So if you're a dirty control player like me who just wants to make sure the opponent has nothing in play, you heal any damage they deal, you shield your Gideon Hask so that they just, you can't even deal with this thing. You put experience counters everywhere. You just make a board that's totally unassailable. If that all sounds super good to you, then I highly recommend you give this a shot and let me know what you think in the comments down below. That is going to do it for this deck profile. I hope you all have enjoyed this one, and keep tuned to Main Deck. We'll have more, of course, Star Wars Limited content coming. I believe my next deck profile, we're going to be looking at a Hera deck, so I'm really looking forward to showing you what I've been cooking up with a little bit of Hera, because I know Hera is another underrated leader that I think has a little more play than people want to give her credit for, even though she might not be a top tier deck. That's okay. I think you can win some games with her and take down your locals and have a lot of fun too. So we'll look at that next. But until then, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and we will see you in the next one.